Richard D. Wolff is an American economist and professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He is known for his critiques of economic inequality and his advocacy for worker cooperatives as a way to empower individuals and address systemic issues within the economy. Through his books, lectures, and public appearances, Wolff explores topics such as economic democracy and alternative economic models. The United States is an empire going down. I wish I didn't have to say that to you, but it's the truth. And that we can't pretend it, although we surely do try to get away from that. We can't compete. The best, cheapest electric car in the world is made by a Chinese corporation. Over the last 20 years, all the car companies tried as best they could, spending a fortune to become the best and the first to make an electric car. Mr. Musk was the first, and therefore he's so rich, but he's been bypassed. The Chinese have outdone him. By the way, he's no longer the #1 electric car seller in China. That's been taken over by Chinese companies, BYD company in particular. Solar panels are the same, all kinds of chips are the same, the DeepSeek AI mechanism is the same, and we could go on. Yesterday I saw a whole video devoted to the unmanned air taxis that they have now produced in 2 or 3 Chinese cities. I mean, all of that's coming to the United States sooner or later. It's going around the world. If the United States walls itself off, we will be the laughingstock of the world, as the rest of the world advances with the technology coming out of China, and we sit there unable to move because even our technology will not survive because it will be outdone in terms of the Chinese and therefore have no foreign market. All of these are signs on the wall that the rest of the world is reading, and the United States has to do something to deal with this. If it stays with an open world economy, it means the United States is going to have to adjust to that world economy, adjust to not being #1 in it, adjust to the fact that the US dollar will not be what it has been for 75 years. It'll lose some of its value, maybe a lot of its value, and that'll make our import more expensive. A lot of adjustments and many of them costly. And we know, or we should, that when you have a period of adjustment in an economy, the people at the top, the richest, the most powerful, the CEOs, are in the best position to hold on to their wealth while the adjustment becomes a problem for everybody else. But here in America, that is very dangerous politics. That's the end of the middle class. That's the immiseration of the working class for an unknown length of time. It's already been going on for 20 years. That's why Mr. Trump gets elected, because things even in America are unsettled and worrisome and frightening people. And they look at the conventional Democrats and Republicans, and that's what they get, conventional. But conventional has turned sour for the United States. It isn't the top dog anymore. And what you're getting now is the defensive crouch, the wall. Wall off the people of Central America, wall off the rest of the world. Listen to Mr. Trump. The whole world has been cheating us. You know, if you go to a clinic, they'll call that paranoia. This is a problem. You are reacting to a difficult situation not by trying to sit down with your competitors and work something out, but by imagining you can wall yourself off from the world. It's not going to work. It never has worked with countries just as powerful as the United States. The British Empire in its day was unmatched in human history. They thought they would last forever. England is now a small, wet, offshore island of Europe, and that's what it was centuries ago, and that's what it is returning to. And all of its navy and all of its power and its victory over Napoleon, you know, that's the way it is. And that's what's happening to us. And that's very difficult. I'm compassionate with my fellow Americans. There's no fun going through a decline like this, but you don't make it better by pretending it didn't happen or isn't going on. Mr. Trump is a bloyater. He's going to tell you like dramatic what the bottom line. He's desperate, and his desperation is dangerous. I find it mind-bendingly terrifying to think that the United States imagines that it is going to come out of a war with China allied to Russia. I mean, we have a population of 330 million. Russia and China have together 4 to 5 times that population and a much bigger geography. They cover more land, and they have 5 times the number of people, and they both have nuclear weapons, lots of them, and a big army. And here's a big difference between the 30s and now to keep in mind. Over the last 40 years, the United States has dismantled its industrial capacity. It has focused itself on producing and distributing financial services of all kinds and are doing a lot with high-tech Silicon Valley and all of that. And that has kept it going, and most important, the world has financed the United States. All those rich people I talked about before parking their money here, that's why their money is here. Foreign governments, including Russia and China, keeping their wealth in the United States, which was taken from, or Europe was taken from them in the war with Ukraine in the case of Russia. So they kept their wealth here. We benefited from all of that. None of that is true anymore. China has the great capacity for manufacturing. If you're going to start to produce for war in a major way, they're going to outproduce us. They're going to outproduce us with drones and missiles and planes, and because they have all that, we don't have what we once had. They do. Partly they do because we moved American companies over there or European companies over there. And they're very aware of that advantage. That was their strategy. That's what they pursued. The United States is not in a position unless it is going to risk self-destruction, which maybe it will. It's been done before. Look, the war in Ukraine should be a wake-up call. Don't let it be otherwise. The United States intended to win that. Everything done for the last 10 years in that poor, poor country, the Maidan Revolution, the coup d'etat, the separating them away from Russia, the attempt to bring them into NATO, I mean, it is really straightforward, pretty obvious. And when the war begins, when Russia invades, Mr. Biden and Mr. Blinken telling us Russia would come to its knees, the ruble would collapse. It's all wrong. None of that happened. And the Russians every week move further west and take another chunk of Ukraine under their control. That war is being lost. Dramatically lost. And as the New York Times said a couple of weeks ago, when it had a remarkable article that people should read, in which it documents in detail how at every step of that war, American technicians, American military personnel, did the intelligence, did the reconnaissance, did the strategic planning, selected the targets, enabled the missiles to be shot. I mean, this has been a war between the United States and Russia, referred to as a proxy war, which it pretty much was, but one side lost and one side won. And the reason the Russians won was their reliance with China and India. No question. Even the Russians admit it. They don't deny it. So, I mean, look at this situation. Even if you think about war, which Americans seem to imagine they're just going to win. We lost the war in Vietnam, we lost the war in Afghanistan, we lost the war in Iraq, and we're losing in Ukraine. What kind of a country plans for war with a record like that? This is not the time for war. This is a time for every other conceivable effort. And to give Mr. Trump his due, he kind of sees it in Ukraine. It's kind of, he's given up the ghost there, slowly, painfully, worried about how it'll play in the American public and what his political enemies will do with him. But he's getting out of there because if there's anything crazier than planning for Russia war with China, it's trying to plan for a war with China while you're losing one in Ukraine. I mean, it's so crazy that even a Mr. Trump can see that's gotta stop. That's a no-brainer. If you're still living in the 1980s and 90s, when the United States was still the top dog, when not only was it the top dog but the Soviet Union imploded, so it couldn't be even the counterweight that it had been, wow, then maybe you could think like that. That's where Mr. Blinken still is. That's where Mr. Biden still is. Mr. Trump is able to go beyond, but I'll give him that. He sees that to his credit. But the rest of it is a megalomaniac notion of what the United States is in a position to do. And let me take it one step further. If I'm right, as I suspect I am, if this is going to work out really badly, that these tariff wars and trade wars and capital wars end up the kind of failure that the war in Ukraine is turning out to be, you're going to see the world, and much of the United States turn against Mr. Trump in a spectacular reversal that will be as dramatic, if not more so, than watching him rise to the top, will be watching him crash when this desperation doesn't work. So what's happening is, bottom line, the rest of the world is watching what they believe to be desperate acts. The United States cannot compete its way out of the world economy, so it has to shut the world out. It has to close in on itself with a tariff barrier. It's like building a wall, and it's very symbolic. The wall against the immigrants in the southern border, now the wall against the whole world with the tariffs. This is looked upon by the rest of the world as an admission of failure. And by the way, it's clear in the rest of the world that it's failure in competition with China. And that reputational damage means that all the wealthy of the world are saying to themselves, we're not going to leave the United States, but we're reducing the portion of our wealth that's over there in the United States because it's too risky, and we're going to move out of the United States into less risky assets in other parts of the world. And that's the only way to explain that if you take a look, as I did yesterday, at the movement of the US dollar from January 20, when Mr. Trump becomes president, to April 18th, that's the numbers I looked at just a few days ago, the dollar lost almost 10% of its value. That's because people are unloading it. And when I say people, I mean also rich Americans are being told by their advisors, Do not put as many eggs in the American basket as you used to do, as we used to tell you to do. Now we're telling you there's too much risk. You better buy euros or Japanese yen or Chinese yuan. Deteriorating. We've been saying this on this program for some time. What you're now beginning to see is the accelerated evidence that that's happened. The United States is suffering a wild inflation of egg prices. It has chosen, because it works like denial, it has chosen to blame the egg price inflation on the bird flu. Remarkable. Bacon, which is often eaten with eggs, has also seen a very dramatic price rise over the last 20 years. And at least the last time I remember my biology classes, bacon comes from pigs who do not suffer from the bird flu. Well, what is it? Have pigs had a flu too? Here's the story. 3 or 4 capitalist enterprises dominate in both the pork and egg industries. Not in the same way. It's a bit more in pork than it is in eggs, but it's basically dominating. And for them, a flu, if there is one, means a shortage of eggs, which means the prices go up. And they have a lot of interest in high prices for what they sell. If the price goes up more than the quantity goes down, their profits go up. And guess what? Across the time of this inflation, their profits have gone up. Hint, this is a story about capitalist enterprise and how it reacts. Egg prices are not just up because there's a flu. Bacon prices aren't up at all because it's a flu in birds. Stop. This is capitalism's tendency to monopoly that's playing out its very old role just again. But here we have the Trump government running around the world looking for eggs. The egg businesses that depend on it aren't looking around. Hint, but you don't need hints. Anti-communism at home and anti-Soviet NATO abroad was a wonderful cover to hide something else that was going on, namely the expansion of the American empire. World War II had exhausted the European countries. Those are the ones that had pioneered colonialism. They had the great empires. Britain had India and many other parts of the world. The French had huge portions of Africa. The Germans at one point had also had it. They had lost it a little earlier. The Japanese were expanding. All of those people's empires had been destroyed. They couldn't afford to maintain them after the terrible losses they suffered in World War II. So as they withdrew or were thrown out of their colonies by revolutions, anti-colonial revolutions, the United States stepped in. It didn't have the bad reputation. It had not participated in the old colonialism. It had been a colony itself who fought a violent revolution to stop being one. And that was the mood of the late 20th century. So the United States could quietly come in and establish commercial, industrial, and financial relationships, bringing the dollar, bringing loans from the IMF and World Bank that it controlled. It took over, and its 700 bases were a very convenient accompaniment to becoming the dominant economic power in the world. The US empire replaced the European empires across the second half of the 20th century, but it wasn't admitted and it wasn't made public. It was hidden behind the Cold War, that we have to fight with that evil Russian empire. Russia did develop nuclear weapons during the Cold War, so they became a serious military problem for the US, but they were never a political problem. The United States outmaneuvered them in the United Nations at every turn, and they were laughably behind the United States economically across the entire Cold War. The GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States during the Cold War, was always 10 to 20 times that of the Soviet Union. There was no economic competition. There couldn't have been. The Soviet Union had no chance. And so, in that period, the United States accomplished what it set out to. It did contain the Soviet Union. It did. And it did squash the labor movement, the socialists, and the communists. The labor movement was 1/3 of our working class population in 1950. It's now 1/10. A very dramatic, systematic drop. The Communist Party barely holds on to a minimum existence in the United States, and the same is true for the 2 old socialist parties. They exist, but their influence is a tiny fraction of what it once was at the end of World War II. The old Cold War did its job, and then a number of things happened to change everything, and that's what's so important to understand now. Number 1, the Soviet Union, which was the whole story of the Cold War, collapsed in 1989 and 90. It's gone from the story. You can't sustain a Cold War against an enemy who isn't there. The Soviet Union went through a crisis period lasting several years, during which it gave up its socialist or communist characters and became another capitalist country. Yes, the government has a big role there, but it does in many parts of Europe. That's not unique to Russia. It does in many parts of the world, which are not called a Soviet bloc, never were, and aren't now. The Soviet Union became another, albeit big, European capitalist country with a large governmental sector, but it really shook up the whole idea of the Cold War. Number 1. Number 2, the rest of the world recovered from all the damage done in World War II. Took them decades, but they did. Led by, in the capitalist world, Germany and Japan, who really came roaring back to become the dominant capitalist countries other than the United States in the latter part of the 20th century. And then even more dramatic, much more dramatic, the explosive growth of capitalist relationships in China. And by capitalist relationships, I mean the employer-employee way of organizing business, whether that's in a private enterprise or one owned and operated by the government. If you hold on to the minority of executives and leaders and capitalists, it doesn't matter whether they're state employees or private people. The relationship in production between them and the mass of employees is quite similar. It's why we call one of them private capitalism and the other one state capitalism. Socialism sort of gets involved with state capitalism, and you have to be a little bit more complicated. China holds on to employer-employee relationships, but it also has the right, as it does, to claim that it is socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's a little bit like Scandinavia was socialism with Swedish characteristics, or Germany is socialism with German characteristics, and so on. My point here is that the changes that happened, particularly at the end of the 20th century, were the beginning of the end of the old Cold War, and we're now living at the end. Here were other changes that played a role. The United States empire began to shrink. Its place was taken, particularly in the last few years, by the rising economic power, strength, and wealth of China. For the first time in a century, the United States has a major economic competitor. The Soviet Union never was. China is. And China, with its allies, the BRICS, is extremely formidable. It's a richer bloc than the United States and its major allies, Germany, Britain, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan, the so-called G7. They are a smaller economic unit than China and its BRICS allies, and the whole world is now adjusting to the change, the end of the dominance of the United States itself. The United States cannot afford the cost of its shrinking empire. It tried to hold on in Vietnam. It was defeated. It tried to hold on in Afghanistan. It was defeated. It tried to hold on in Iraq. It was defeated. The war in Ukraine is a process of defeating the United States. It isn't therefore all that surprising that you would eventually see a political movement in the United States, Trump, saying, let's cut our losses. We cannot do it. We cannot maintain an empire against what's happening in the rest of the world. We can't do it militarily, even though we remain the strongest military.